The first thing Jacob Lawrence noticed when he rode into the ravine was the blood on the rocks, dark and half frozen in the bitter February wind that swept across the Arizona territory. He had been tracking a stray Mustang for the better part of the morning in 1878, and what he found instead would change the course of his life forever. There, huddled against a boulder with her arms wrapped around her knees, was a young woman with long black hair matted with dirt and blood. Her buckskin dress was torn in several places, and her dark eyes held a terror so profound that Jacob felt his chest tighten with a protective fury he had never experienced before. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements gentle. The woman pressed herself harder against the rock, trembling violently. Jacob could see she was Apache, probably no more than 19 or 20 years old, and the bruises on her arms and face told a story that made his jaw clench with anger at whoever had done this to her. "Easy now," Jacob said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Jacob. Can you understand me?" The woman stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and he could see she was on the verge of collapse. He took another careful step forward, and she flinched so violently that she nearly fell. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse and broken, in English that surprised him with its clarity despite her obvious distress. "Will you hurt me too?" Those 5 words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He stopped immediately, holding up both hands. "No," he said firmly. "I will never hurt you. I promise you that on my life." She searched his face for what felt like an eternity, and Jacob stood perfectly still, letting her see that he meant every word. He was a tall man, 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and honest hazel eyes that had seen plenty of hardship, but had never grown cruel from it. He had worked ranches and cattle drives from Texas to Montana, but he had always prided himself on being a decent man in a world that often rewarded cruelty. "You are hurt," he said gently, "and you are freezing. Will you let me help you? I have a camp not far from here with a fire and food. You need warmth and medicine." The woman continued to stare at him, and Jacob could see the internal battle playing out across her face. She was clearly terrified, but she was also intelligent enough to know that she would not survive much longer out here in her current condition. The temperature was already dropping as afternoon turned toward evening, and the clouds gathering on the horizon promised snow before nightfall. "I will not touch you unless you say I can," Jacob added. "You can ride my horse, and I will walk ahead where you can see me. If you want to leave at any time, you can take the horse and go. I swear it." Something in his words or his tone must have reached her, because she gave the tiniest nod. Jacob felt relief wash over him. He backed away slowly and gathered his horse's reins, then led the bay mare over to where the woman sat. It took her 3 attempts to stand, and when she finally managed it, she swayed dangerously. Jacob instinctively reached out to steady her, but stopped himself just in time, remembering his promise. "Can you mount on your own?" he asked. She nodded again, but nearly fell when she tried to lift her foot to the stirrup. This time Jacob did step forward, but he moved slowly and kept his voice calm. "I am going to help you up. I will put my hand on your elbow, nothing more. Is that all right?" After a long moment, she nodded. Jacob gently supported her arm as she pulled herself into the saddle, and he tried not to notice how badly she was shaking or how light she felt, as though she had not eaten properly in days. Once she was seated, he handed her the reins and then took the horse's bridle, leading them out of the ravine and toward his camp. The walk took 20 minutes, and Jacob kept up a steady stream of quiet talk the whole way, not really expecting answers but hoping his voice would help calm her. He told her about his horse, about the Mustang he had been tracking, about the weather and how he thought they would get snow tonight. Anything to fill the silence with something other than fear. His camp was simple but well organized. He had a good fire going in a ring of stones, a bedroll laid out near enough for warmth but far enough to avoid sparks, and his supplies arranged neatly beside a fallen log that served as a seat. Jacob helped the woman dismount, careful to keep his touch minimal and his movements predictable. She stood near the fire, holding her hands toward the flames, and he could see now in the better light just how badly she had been hurt. "I have some whiskey for cleaning wounds," Jacob said, rummaging through his saddlebag, "and clean cloth for bandages. I also have some dried meat and beans I can heat up. When did you last eat?" The woman did not answer, but her eyes followed his every movement. Jacob found what he needed and set it on the log, then moved back to give her space. "My mother was a nurse during the war," he said. "She taught me how to tend wounds properly, but I understand if you do not want me to help with that. I can tell you what to do, and you can do it yourself if you prefer." For the first time, the woman spoke again. "You will help." Her voice was still rough, but there was a note of decision in it, as though she had made some kind of choice and would see it through despite her fear. Jacob nodded and gestured to the log. "Sit down. The warmth will help." She sat carefully, wincing as she moved, and Jacob knelt in front of her with the whiskey and cloth. He worked slowly and explained everything before he did it. "I am going to clean the cut on your forehead first. This will sting." He dampened the cloth with whiskey and gently dabbed at the wound above her right eye. She flinched but did not pull away. As he worked, Jacob took careful inventory of her injuries. Besides the cut on her forehead, she had bruises on both arms that looked like finger marks, a split lip, scrapes on her hands and knees, and what appeared to be older injuries that were already healing. Whoever had done this had hurt her multiple times over several days at least. "What is your name?" Jacob asked as he moved to clean the scrapes on her hands. She hesitated, then said, "Grace." Jacob looked up in surprise. That was not an Apache name. She must have seen his expression because she added, "The mission school gave me that name. My Apache name is Gallion. It means wise woman." "Grace is a good name," Jacob said, "and so is Gallion. Which do you prefer?" "Grace," she said after a moment. "I am used to it now." "Grace it is, then. My last name is Lawrence. I have been working a ranch about 30 miles south of here, but the owner sold out and moved east. I was heading north to find new work when I found you." He finished cleaning her wounds and wrapped bandages around the worst of them. When he was done, he stood and moved to the fire to heat up some beans in a small pot. Grace sat very still, watching him with those dark, wary eyes. "How did you come to be in that ravine?" Jacob asked gently. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to, but it might help." Grace was silent for so long that Jacob thought she would not answer. Then, in a voice barely audible over the crackling fire, she said, "There were 3 men, white men. They came to the place where I was staying with my aunt and uncle. My parents died 2 years ago from the fever, and I have been living with my mother's sister since then. The men wanted whiskey. My uncle said no. They beat him and took me. They said they would sell me in Mexico." Jacob's hands tightened on the pot handle until his knuckles turned white. "Where are they now?" "I escaped yesterday. They had been drinking, and the one who was supposed to watch me fell asleep. I ran. They followed, but I hid in the rocks. This morning I heard gunshots. I think they fought with each other, or maybe someone else found them. I do not know." "And your aunt and uncle?" Grace's face crumpled, and for the first time tears spilled down her cheeks. "My uncle was hurt badly. I do not know if he lived. My aunt tried to help me, and they hit her. I ran because she told me to run." Jacob set the pot down and moved back to sit on the ground near the log. far enough away that she would not feel crowded but close enough that she could hear his low voice. "I am sorry. No one deserves what happened to you. No one." They sat in silence for a while as the beans heated. When they were ready, Jacob filled 2 tin plates and handed one to Grace along with a spoon. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, and Jacob was glad he had made plenty. He watched her from the corner of his eye, this brave young woman who had survived something that would have broken many people. When she had finished eating, Grace set the plate down and looked at him directly for the first time. "Why are you helping me?" "Because it is the right thing to do," Jacob said simply. "And because no one should have to face what you faced alone. Most men would not help an Apache woman." "Then most men are fools," Jacob said firmly. "You are a person who needed help. That is all that matters to me." Grace studied him in the firelight, and Jacob met her gaze steadily. He wanted her to see that he meant what he said, that his help came without conditions or expectations. Finally, she nodded slightly, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased. "It will snow soon," Jacob said. "You should take the bedroll. I will keep the fire going and sleep by it. You will freeze." "I have a heavy coat and gloves. I have slept in worse conditions." Grace looked like she wanted to argue but was too exhausted to find the words. Jacob stood and arranged the bedroll closer to the fire, then helped her settle into it. He piled on his extra blanket as well, ignoring her protests. When she was as comfortable as he could make her, he moved to the other side of the fire and wrapped himself in his coat. The snow started an hour later, soft flakes that drifted down through the darkness and began to cover the ground in a thin, white layer. Jacob fed the fire and listened to Grace's breathing slowly even out as she fell into sleep. He thought about what she had told him, about the men who had taken her and hurt her, about her aunt and uncle who might be dead or dying. He thought about the courage it must have taken for her to escape and then to trust him, a stranger, when she had every reason to believe all men would hurt her. By morning, there were 4 inches of snow on the ground, and the sky was the pale gray that promised more to come. Jacob had dozed fitfully through the night, waking every hour to tend the fire. Grace stirred as the sun rose, and he saw her tense immediately when she realized where she was. Then she saw him across the fire and relaxed slightly. "Good morning," Jacob said. "How do you feel?" "Sore," Grace admitted, "but warmer." "That is good. I am going to make coffee and some breakfast, then I think we should head south toward Genoa. It is a small town, but they will have a doctor who can look at you properly, and maybe the sheriff can send someone to check on your aunt and uncle." Grace sat up slowly, wincing. "You do not have to take me there. You said you were going north." "Plans change," Jacob said. "Right now, making sure you are safe is more important than finding work." "Why?" Grace asked again, and there was a note of genuine bewilderment in her voice, as though kindness was so foreign to her recent experience that she could not fathom it. Jacob poured water into the coffee pot and set it on the fire. "My father died when I was 12. After that, it was just my mother and me. She worked herself half to death keeping us fed and clothed, and plenty of people in our town looked down on us because we were poor. But there was a rancher named Tom Jenkins who gave me work when I was 14, even though I was scrawny and did not know much about cattle. He said every person deserves a chance to prove themselves. He taught me how to be a good hand, how to be honest in my dealings, and how to stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. I owe him for the man I became, and I figure the best way to honor that is to help others when I can." Grace absorbed this in silence. "Where is your mother now?" "She died 3 years ago. Pneumonia took her fast." Jacob poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to Grace. "I miss her every day." "I miss my parents too," Grace said quietly. "They were good people." They tried to keep our old ways alive but also teach me English and how to live in the white man's world. They said I would need both to survive. They sound wise. They were. Grace sipped the coffee and made a face at the bitter taste. Jacob smiled despite himself. I know it is terrible. I never learned the trick of making it taste good. To his surprise, Grace smiled back, just a tiny quirk of her lips, but it transformed her face. She was beautiful, Jacob realized with a start. Not just pretty, but genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her features and everything to do with the strength and intelligence that shone through despite her pain. They broke camp after breakfast and headed south through the snow. Jacob walked alongside his horse while Grace rode, and they made slow but steady progress. The landscape was stark and beautiful, red rocks dusted with white snow under a gray sky. They did not talk much, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. By late afternoon, they reached Genoa, a small settlement nestled in a valley with about 40 buildings clustered around a main street. Jacob led them directly to the doctor's office, a small wooden structure with a sign that read Dr. Samuel Morris. Inside, a thin, older man with wire spectacles looked up from a desk covered in papers. "Help you?" he asked, then his eyes widened when he saw Grace's battered face. "Good Lord, what happened?" "She needs medical attention," Jacob said. "She was hurt by men who took her against her will." Dr. Morris was already on his feet, gesturing Grace toward an examination room. "Come in, young lady. Let me have a look at you." He glanced at Jacob. "You can wait out here." Grace looked back at Jacob with sudden panic in her eyes. He stepped forward and said to the doctor, "Would it be all right if I waited just inside the door? She has been through a lot, and I think she would feel safer." Dr. Morris looked between them and nodded. "Of course, just stay by the door and give us some privacy." Jacob positioned himself with his back to them, staring at the wall while the doctor examined Grace. He heard her quiet answers to the doctor's questions, heard the doctor's occasional grunt or murmur. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, Dr. Morris said, "You can turn around now, young man." Jacob turned to find Grace sitting on the examination table, fresh bandages on her arms and forehead. Dr. Morris was washing his hands in a basin. "She will heal," the doctor said. "The cuts are not deep and there is no sign of infection yet. The bruising will take a week or two to fade. She needs rest, good food, and a safe place to stay." He fixed Jacob with a stern look. "Can you provide that?" "I will do my best," Jacob said. "I was planning to find a room at the boarding house for her. For both of you, I hope. You look like you have not slept properly in days." Dr. Morris dried his hands and turned back to Grace. "You are a lucky young woman. If this man had not found you, you might have frozen to death out there." "I know," Grace said softly. "I am grateful." They left the doctor's office and walked down the main street toward the boarding house. The town was quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few people visible through windows or walking between buildings. Jacob noticed several people staring at them, at Grace in particular, and he felt his protective instincts rise. He moved slightly closer to her, a subtle shift that said he was with her and would not tolerate trouble. The boarding house was run by a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Alina Patterson, who took one look at Grace and frowned. "We do not rent to Indians." Jacob felt anger flare in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "She is with me and she needs a room. I will pay for a week in advance." "I do not care if you pay for a year. I said no Indians." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his hazel eyes hard. "That is a shame, because I was about to rent 2 rooms and pay you well for them. But if you would rather turn away good money because of your prejudices, I am sure the hotel down the street will be more accommodating." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "The hotel is full. Stage came through yesterday." "Then I guess we will ride on to the next town," Jacob said. "Come on, Grace." They were at the door when Mrs. Patterson called out, "Wait." She looked unhappy but calculating. 2 rooms, 1 week. $15 in advance. Jacob knew he was being overcharged by at least half, but he did not argue. He counted out the money and placed it on the counter. Mrs. Patterson gave them 2 keys and pointed to the stairs. "Second floor, rooms 5 and 6. Meals are served at 7 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. If you miss them, you do not eat." The rooms were small but clean, with single beds, washstands, and not much else. Jacob made sure Grace was settled in room 5, then went to his own room and finally allowed himself to collapse on the bed. He was exhausted, but more than that, he was worried. He had enough money to last a few weeks if he was careful, but then he would need to find work. And what would happen to Grace? She could not stay at this boarding house indefinitely with Mrs. Patterson looking at her like she was something dirty. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Grace standing in the hallway, looking uncertain. "I am sorry to bother you." "I just wanted to thank you again, for everything." "You are not bothering me," Jacob said, "and you do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do," Grace said firmly. "You saved my life, that deserves thanks." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Grace must have felt it too because she dropped her eyes and said quickly, "I should let you rest. Good night, Jacob. Good night, Grace." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. They would meet for meals, enduring Mrs. Patterson's disapproving looks and the curious stares of the other boarders. Afterward, they would walk around town, with Jacob inquiring about work and Grace gradually regaining her strength. On the 3rd day, they went to see Sheriff William Hayes, a burly man with a thick mustache and surprisingly kind eyes. Jacob explained what had happened to Grace, and the sheriff listened carefully, taking notes. When they were finished, he said, "I will send a deputy out to check on your aunt and uncle, miss. Can you tell me where they live?" Grace gave him directions to a small Apache settlement about 50 miles east. Sheriff Hayes nodded and said, "It will take a few days, but we will get word to them or find out what happened. As for the men who took you, can you describe them?" Grace described 3 men in their 30s and 40s, one with a scar on his left cheek, another missing 2 fingers on his right hand, and the third with red hair. The sheriff's expression darkened. "That sounds like the Driscoll brothers and their cousin. They have been causing trouble all over the territory. If they fought with each other, well, I cannot say I would mourn any of them." A week later, the deputy returned with news. Grace's uncle had survived his injuries and was recovering. Her aunt was badly shaken but unharmed. They sent word that they were grateful Grace was safe and hoped she would return when she was ready. As for the Driscoll men, the deputy had found their bodies about 10 miles from where Jacob had found Grace. It appeared they had argued over money and shot each other. The territory would not miss them. Grace wept when she heard her aunt and uncle were alive, tears of relief that she had been holding back since the ordeal began. Jacob sat with her in the small parlor of the boarding house and let her cry, offering silent support. When she finally composed herself, she said, "I should go back to them." "If that is what you want," Jacob said carefully, "but there is no rush. Make sure you are fully healed first." Grace nodded, but Jacob could see uncertainty in her eyes. Over the past week, he had come to know her better. She was intelligent and had a quiet sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe. She had attended the mission school until she was 16 and could read and write English as well as speak it fluently. She knew traditional Apache skills like tanning leather and weaving baskets, But she also loved to read books and had a curiosity about the world that the mission school had encouraged. For his part, Jacob found himself thinking about Grace constantly. He loved the way she tilted her head when she was considering something, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, the quiet strength that radiated from her despite everything she had been through. He knew he was falling in love with her, but he did not know if she felt the same way, or if he even had the right to pursue those feelings given what she had recently survived. 2 weeks after they arrived in Genoa, Jacob found work at a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. The owner, a gruff man named Henry Taylor, needed an extra hand for the spring roundup and was willing to pay fair wages. It meant Jacob would be gone during the day but could return to town at night. The morning he was set to start, he met Grace for breakfast and told her about the job. She smiled and said, "That is wonderful, Jacob. I am happy for you." "It means I will not be around as much during the day," Jacob said. "Will you be all right?" "I will be fine," Grace assured him. "I am thinking of looking for work myself, maybe at the general store or helping with laundry. I cannot stay idle forever." Jacob wanted to tell her she did not need to work, that he would take care of her, but he recognized the need for independence in her voice. She had been through something that had stripped away her control, and finding work was a way to reclaim it. So he just nodded and said, "Let me know if you need any help." Grace did find work at the general store run by a kind older couple named the Carlyles. Mrs. Ruth Carlyle took one look at Grace and seemed to see past the prejudices that plagued others in town. She hired Grace to help stock shelves, assist customers, and keep the books. Grace's mission school education made her perfectly suited for the work, and she thrived in the structured environment. Spring turned to early summer, and Jacob and Grace continued to see each other every evening. They would take walks after dinner, talking about their days and slowly sharing more about their lives. Jacob told her about growing up poor but loved, about his mother's fierce determination to give him a good life, about the loneliness he had felt since her death. Grace told him about her childhood in an Apache camp, about learning to ride before she could walk, about the pain of watching her people struggle to maintain their way of life in a world that was changing too fast. One evening in late May, they were sitting by the creek that ran through Genoa, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was warm and filled with the sound of crickets and frogs. Grace had been quiet for a while, and Jacob sensed she was working up to saying something. Finally, she said, "Jacob, I need to tell you something." His heart clenched with sudden worry. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about going back to my aunt and uncle. They need me and I miss them, but I also do not want to go." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "I do not want to go because of you." Jacob felt his breath catch. "Grace, Let me finish," she said gently. "When you found me, I was broken, not just hurt, but broken inside. I did not think I could ever trust anyone again, especially not a man. But you have been patient and kind and have never asked for anything in return. You have shown me that goodness still exists in this world, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Jacob reached for her hand, and this time she did not flinch or pull away. He laced his fingers through hers and said, "I have been in love with you since the day I watched you smile for the first time at my terrible coffee. I did not say anything because I did not want to pressure you or make you feel like I expected something because I helped you. But Grace, I love you. I love your strength and your intelligence and your courage. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me want to be a better man." Grace leaned forward and Jacob met her halfway. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they pulled apart, Grace was crying, but these were tears of joy. "Will you marry me?" Jacob asked, the words tumbling out before he could think better of them. I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other a few months, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it. I want to build a home with you, a real home where you feel safe and loved every single day." "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later by the town preacher, a kind man named Reverend Thomas Mills, who did not care that Grace was Apache and Jacob was white. Sheriff Hayes stood as witness, along with Mrs. Carlyle and Dr. Morris. It was a small ceremony, but it felt right and true. Jacob had been saving his wages and managed to buy a small piece of land on the outskirts of Genoa with a tiny cabin that needed work. They spent their first months of marriage fixing it up together, and Grace brought her aunt and uncle to visit. Her uncle, a dignified man named Naoch who spoke limited English, shook Jacob's hand and said through Grace's translation, "You have given my niece back her life. You are family now." That summer, Jacob and Grace worked side by side building their life together. Jacob continued working at the Taylor Ranch while also tending their own small plot of land where they planted vegetables and kept a few chickens. Grace continued working at the general store and used her skills to make beautiful baskets that Mrs. Carlyle sold for good money. In the evenings, they would sit on their small porch and watch the sun set, talking about their dreams for the future. Grace wanted to start a school for Apache children who wanted to learn English and reading. Jacob wanted to eventually buy his own small ranch where he could raise cattle and horses. They both wanted children someday, when they felt ready. Life was not always easy. There were people in Genoa who disapproved of their marriage and made their prejudices known. Mrs. Patterson refused to speak to them after the wedding. Some customers at the general store would not let Grace help them. Once, a drunk cowhand at the saloon said something crude about Grace, and Jacob hit him. Sheriff Hayes had to break up the fight, but he told Jacob quietly afterward that the cowhand had it coming, but there were good people too. The Carlyles became like family, always ready with advice or help when needed. Sheriff Hayes and his wife, Emily, invited them to dinner regularly. Dr. Morris checked on Grace frequently in those first months, wanting to make sure she was healing properly both physically and emotionally. Henry Taylor proved to be a fair employer and even gave Jacob a bonus at the end of the summer for his hard work. As fall arrived and the leaves began to turn, Grace announced she was pregnant. Jacob swept her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. They spent the next months preparing, with Jacob building a cradle and Grace sewing tiny clothes from fabric Mrs. Carlyle gave her. In March of 1879, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him James Naoch Lawrence, honoring both their families. Jacob held his son for the first time and felt tears streaming down his face as he looked from the baby to Grace, who was exhausted but radiant. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for trusting me, for loving me, for giving me this family." "Thank you for finding me," Grace whispered back. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving when I could not see it myself." The first years of James's life were busy and full of love. Jacob had saved enough money to buy a small herd of cattle, and their homestead began to thrive. Grace had to stop working at the general store after James was born, but she began teaching English and reading to a few Apache children whose parents had heard about her and sought her out. She held classes in their small cabin twice a week, and Jacob built extra benches to accommodate the students. When James was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time she gave birth to a daughter they named Gwyneth Elizabeth Lawrence, after Jacob's mother Elizabeth, and with a name that started with G like Grace's. Gwyneth had her mother's dark eyes and would grow to have her fierce spirit as well. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Jacob expanded their ranch bit by bit until they had a decent-sized operation that required hiring 2 ranch hands. Grace's school grew until she had 15 students, and they had to build a separate structure just for classes. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and English, but she also taught traditional Apache stories and crafts, believing strongly that her students needed to know both worlds to survive. When James was 8 and Gwyneth was 6, Grace gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Joshua and Jesse. The cabin that had seemed spacious for 2 now bulged at the seams with 6 people, so Jacob built an addition with 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. There were hard times, too. The winter of 1885 was brutal, and they lost half their cattle to the cold. Grace's aunt died that same year, and Grace grieved deeply for the woman who had raised her after her parents' death. Jacob's old injury from a bull goring got infected and nearly killed him, but Dr. Morris pulled him through with Grace nursing him day and night. But through it all, their love for each other never wavered. On difficult days, Jacob would come home exhausted and discouraged, and Grace would hold him and remind him of how far they had come. When Grace struggled with memories of what had happened to her all those years ago, Jacob would sit with her in the dark and hold her hand until the nightmares passed. They had a tradition of walking down to the creek every year on the anniversary of the day Jacob had found Grace. They would sit in the same spot where he had proposed and talk about the year that had passed and the year to come. On their 10th anniversary of that day, they sat watching the sunset with their 4 children playing nearby, and Grace said, "Do you remember when I asked you why you were helping me?" "I remember," Jacob said, his arm around her shoulders. "I think I finally understand the answer." It was not just because it was the right thing to do, though it was. It was because you saw me, really saw me, as a person deserving of kindness and respect. You did not see an Apache woman or a victim. You just saw another human being who needed help. That gift, that simple act of seeing me, changed everything. Jacob pulled her closer. "You changed everything for me, too. Before I found you, I was just drifting, working job to job with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something permanent, something meaningful. You and our children are the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching James teach the twins how to skip stones while Gwyneth waded in the shallow water. Finally, Grace said, "I was thinking we should visit my uncle next month. James is old enough now to really understand his Apache heritage, and I want him and the others to know that side of their family." "That is a good idea," Jacob agreed. "We can take a week and make a real trip of it." They did make that trip, and it was the first of many. Naach, now an old man, was delighted to see his great-niece and meet her children. He taught James and Gwyneth traditional songs and showed the twins how to track animals. Grace's people welcomed Jacob with a warmth that moved him deeply, accepting him as one of their own because he loved Grace and honored her heritage. As the years continued to pass, their ranch became one of the most successful in the area. Jacob's reputation as an honest rancher and a good man spread, and he was often asked to help settle disputes or give advice to younger ranchers just starting out. Grace's school gained recognition even beyond Genoa, and families would travel from 50 miles away to enroll their children. But more importantly than their material success was the family they built. Their children grew up knowing they were loved unconditionally, that their mixed heritage was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. James became a teacher like his mother. Gwyneth married a rancher from California and moved west, and the twins grew into fine young men who worked the ranch with their father. In the summer of 1898, 20 years after Jacob had found Grace in that ravine, they celebrated their 19th wedding anniversary with a large gathering at the ranch. Friends and family came from all over the territory, including Grace's uncle Naoch, who was 90 years old but still sharp as a tack. Sheriff Hayes, now retired, came with his wife. The Carlyles brought enough food to feed an army. Dr. Morris, elderly and mostly retired himself, made the trip to see the family he had helped bring into the world. As the sun set and the party wound down, Jacob and Grace slipped away to their old spot by the creek. They were both in their 40s now, with lines on their faces and gray in their hair, but to Jacob, Grace was as beautiful as the day he had first really looked at her and seen her smile. "You ever regret it?" Jacob asked suddenly. "Marrying a man you barely knew? Staying in Genoa instead of going back to your people?" Grace took his weathered hand in hers and said firmly, "Not for one single moment. You gave me a life beyond what I could have imagined. You gave me love and safety and children and purpose. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Jacob said. "That has been my goal every day since I found you." "I am happy," Grace said simply. "I am surrounded by people I love in a place I have helped build. Our children are good people who will make the world better. What more could I possibly want?" They kissed as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. And in that moment, Jacob thought back to that terrified young woman who had asked him, "Will you hurt me too?" And how far they had both come since then. Years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Gwyneth gave them 3 grandchildren, and James married a schoolteacher from Phoenix who fit perfectly into their family. The twins remained bachelors, devoted to the ranch and to taking care of their aging parents. When Naoch died at the age of 93, Grace grieved but took comfort in the fact that he had lived a long life and had died peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, she spoke in both Apache and English about the importance of honoring the past while building the future, words that resonated with everyone present. The new century arrived, and with it came changes. Genoa grew from a small settlement to a proper town with a school, a church, and paved streets. The Arizona Territory was moving toward statehood. Grace's teaching methods were adopted by other schools, and she was invited to speak at a conference in Tucson about educating children from different cultures. But through all the changes, the core of their life remained constant. Jacob and Grace still walked to the creek on special evenings. They still held hands across the dinner table. They still looked at each other with love and gratitude for the life they had built together. In the spring of 1903, as they celebrated 25 years of marriage, their entire family gathered at the ranch. All 4 of their children were there, along with 5 grandchildren who ran wild through the property much as their parents had done years before. There was laughter and music and more food than any group could possibly eat. Jacob stood on the porch watching the gathering and felt Grace slip her hand into his. "A quarter century," she said softly. "Can you believe it? Sometimes it feels like no time at all, and sometimes it feels like you have always been part of my life," Jacob said. "I cannot remember what my life was like before you." "It was lonely," Grace said, "for both of us, but we found each other." "No," Jacob corrected gently. "I found you frozen and afraid, and you gave me the gift of your trust. Everything good in my life came from that moment." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "You healed me. Not just my body, but my spirit. You showed me that the world still had goodness in it, that I could still trust and love and build a future. I was so broken, Jacob, but you had the patience to let me heal at my own pace." "You were never broken," Jacob said firmly. "You were hurt, but your core, your strength, that was always there. I just gave you a safe place to remember it." They stood together watching their family, the family that had started with a terrified young woman, a kind-hearted cowboy, and a question that had changed both their lives. "Will you hurt me too?" she had asked, and with every day since, Jacob had proven the answer was no. As the sun set on their 25th anniversary, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Jacob and Grace knew they had built something lasting. Not just a ranch or a school or even a family, though those were all important. They had built a love based on trust and respect, a love that had weathered prejudice and hardship, a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. Their children would carry that legacy forward, teaching their own children that love transcends culture and circumstance, that kindness and patience can heal even the deepest wounds, that two people from different worlds can build something beautiful together. And every year on that particular February day, no matter how old they got or how much the world around them changed, Jacob and Grace would walk to the creek and remember. They would remember the cold and the fear and the question that had started everything. They would remember the choice to trust, the decision to love, the commitment to build a life together. They would sit in their special spot, hold hands weathered by years of work and love, and watch the sun set over the land they had made their own. And Jacob would sometimes say, "Thank you for letting me prove that not all men would hurt you." And Grace would always reply, "Thank you for being the man who healed me instead." Decades later, when both of them had passed on peacefully in their old age, their children would tell their grandchildren the story of how their grandparents met. They would talk about a cowboy who found a terrified Apache girl in a ravine and chose kindness when he could have chosen cruelty or indifference. They would talk about a young woman brave enough to trust again after betrayal and build a new life from the ashes of trauma. But most of all, they would talk about love. Real, lasting, transformative love that proved stronger than prejudice, harder than fear, and more enduring than time. The kind of love that built not just a family, but a legacy of compassion that would echo through generations, reminding everyone who heard the story that in the hardest moments, we all have a choice. We can hurt or we can heal. And sometimes, the choice to heal can change the world. The ranch remained in the Lawrence family for 3 more generations, and a small plaque was placed by the creek where Jacob had proposed. It read simply, "Here 2 souls found each other and built a love that lasted forever." May all who visit remember that healing is always possible, and love can bloom even in the coldest winter. And so the story of Jacob and Grace became legend in Genoa, a reminder that even in the harsh world of the Arizona Territory in the late 1800s, even when violence and prejudice seemed to rule the day, kindness could still triumph. One cowboy's decision to help a frightened young woman instead of passing by had created ripples that spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. Their love story became a testament to the power of trust, the importance of patience, and the transformative nature of unconditional love. It proved that healing is not always immediate, that trust must be earned through consistent action, and that the greatest love stories are not about grand gestures but about choosing each other every single day, through good times and bad, until death parts you. And in the end, when all was said and done, when their lives had been lived and their story complete, what remained was simple but profound. A cowboy had found an Apache girl frozen and afraid. She had asked if he would hurt her too, and he had healed her instead. From that single choice, from that one moment of compassion in a harsh world, had blossomed a love that transcended every barrier placed before it and created a family whose legacy would endure long after they were gone. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth honoring. Because in the end, it was not just the story of Jacob and Grace. It was the story of what we all can be if we choose compassion over cruelty, trust over fear, and love over hate. It was a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that one person's kindness can change another person's entire world. And sometimes, that changed world can become a better place not just for two people, but for everyone their love touches.